Hi, I'm Caitlin, and in today's video, I'm going to teach you about the exposure triangle, which consists of the three settings that, when balanced correctly, will determine the correct exposure of a photograph and leave you with high quality results. Whether you're a professional photographer, someone who takes pictures for a hobby, or you simply want to learn how to take a good picture, the one thing you absolutely need to know about is the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle consists of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I'm going to take you through all three of these and how to know if your camera is correctly exposed for your photo or video. If you can master all three of these settings, your pictures will be crisp and flawless. I'll be using a Sony a7S III in this video. The first setting in the exposure triangle is aperture, also referred to as your f-stop. Aperture is a measure of how open or closed your lens's iris is. It refers to the amount of light that gets into the lens and allows for a more creative photo to be taken by making the background either super crisp or blurred out. The lower your aperture or f-stop, the shallower the depth of field and the blurrier the background. The higher it is, the more crisp and in focus your background will be. If you ever hear the term wide open when referring to aperture, that means you have your aperture set to the maximum aperture possible. The maximum aperture is the lowest numbered f-stop your lens can achieve. This lens is a 50mm 1.4, so with this one, the maximum aperture is 1.4. Something that helps me is to think of aperture as an eyeball. The wider the eye is open, the more light is getting in. The same is true for aperture. The wider the aperture is open, the more light is getting into the camera and the blurrier the background. The smaller the opening, the less light gets in, which creates a sharper, less blurry background. Let's take a picture of this Movado watch at an aperture of 1.4. You can see in this image, my subject is in focus, but my background is completely blurred. If I take the same picture at an f-stop of 11, the photo turns out like this. Next up is your shutter speed. Shutter speed is the length of time your camera shutter is open, exposing light on the sensor. The lower your shutter speed, the longer your camera will take to snap a photo because it's allowing more light to hit the sensor. Faster shutter speeds give the sensor less time to gather light, so the higher the shutter speed, the darker the photo. The shutter speed also has to do with the motion blur of your image. The higher the shutter speed, the sharper your image and the less motion blur. If I take a picture of the fountain in our atrium at a shutter speed of 125, you can see that the image is very crisp with little to no motion blur. However, if I lower my shutter speed down to 60, you'll see the image is not quite as refined and you can see some motion blur here. If you're taking long exposure shots of something like the night sky, you'll want a very low shutter speed to allow for more light to hit the sensor. You'll also want to make sure your camera is set up on a tripod and you're using a remote shutter for the highest quality photo to minimize handshake. Handshake is a huge factor when your shutter speed is low because even the slightest movement can result in a blurry photo, like this one here that I took with a shutter speed of 30. Finally, we have ISO. ISO is the sensitivity of the camera's sensor. The higher your ISO, the brighter your image will be. ISO can help you in low light situations to be more creative when it comes to your aperture and shutter speed. However, that comes with a price. The higher your ISO, the more grain and noise will be added to your photo and the less detail will be retained. If you want your image to look crisp and clean, you'll want your ISO as low as possible. Ideally, you should only raise your ISO when it's not possible to raise your aperture or shutter speed. If I were to take a picture of this bar setup with an ISO of 100, the picture would come out like this. But if I were to take the same picture, but adjust my settings so my ISO is at 6400, the image would turn out like this. Anytime you adjust one of these settings, you'll have to adjust the others to compensate for the loss or gain of exposure. Mastering the art of balancing all three settings takes some time and practice, but once it clicks, your photos will be high quality and flawless. If you have any questions on the cameras we have here at Apt, please feel free to call, email, or chat with us online. We're always happy to help. Until next time, get out there and get snapping.